Take. When I was serving here as the youth and family minister, when all of you paid for me to go get what we call continuing education, it's a racket, let me tell you. Your current senior warden, Nancy Barrett, at the time introduced me to what we might call summer camp for adults, Ghost Ranch. Just by show of hand, has anybody here been to Ghost Ranch? Okay, a sampling. This place is outside of Abiquiu, New Mexico, and it was created by the Presbyterian Church. It's set up like a summer camp, and it has programs for children and teens, just like you would expect, but it also has a whole layer of opportunities for adults, theological, spiritual, intellectual programs. And so I signed up to take a class, and the class was on how to write about social justice issues. It was taught by a professor at Baylor, Greg Garrett, who was an Episcopalian. Now, at the time, my son was about 8 years old, and so he went with me, and we camped out in a tent. And you can do that. It's cheaper. I was trying to save you some money. Right? Or you can stay in a really fancy hotel room on the camp. But we joined Nancy and a group of her friends who had been going to Ghost Ranch for years. So they were very familiar with the place. And it's a great vacation for families. I really highly recommend it to you. But Nancy's group had, shall we say, this ritual that they kept at the end of every day. It was just before dinner, each evening, they would meet under a big shady tree just outside the dining hall for what they affectionately referred to as tacky hour. We had cocktails, shared stories from the day, with this understanding that this was a judgment-free zone, except for the judgment that you might reserve for the people that you had encountered that day who were not present at tacky hour. So to quote Clary Belcher's character in the movie Still Magnolias, if you don't have anything nice to say about somebody, then come sit by me. I like sarcasm. I like wit. I like acerbic humor. But I also know that most humor comes at the expense of someone or something, right? And even though some things are usually attached to the actions of someone. And maybe that's why puns, right? Puns are such a sweet and innocent form of humor. They almost never hurt anyone, right? Tearing someone or something down is incredibly tempting. What James admonishes in his letter today is something that you and I know too well. Words are powerful. They have the ability to inspire us, build us up, send us out into things that scare us. But they also have the ability to shut us down. I've often wondered, in light of this teaching, how the quality of my life would change if I eliminated all critical negative talk from my speech. I confess to you, and this is truly a confession, that the notion does not appeal to me at all. Would I become boring? Uninteresting? In what ways would it limit my relationships? In that, if people knew that they couldn't be tacky with me, right? That they wouldn't want to seek me out for relationship, for conversation. Do you know somebody who is so nice and so kind and so loving in the way that they speak about everything that when you're with them, you're a little bit bored? An example of this, late night television years ago, if you read, there's David Letterman. He was considered just a little bit edgy. So when a guest would come on his show, you weren't quite sure if he was going to be kind or if, maybe in his boredom, he would start to go after them. Do you remember that? And juxtapose that on the channel down the way, Jay Leno, he was criticized for being too amiable. Right? He just would encourage everybody and never say anything negative. The same comparison now might be made between Jimmy Kimmel, who can be a little bit acerbic, and Jimmy Fallon, who, if you watch The Tonight Show now, he praises people so much that it's almost like he's a sycophant, right? It seems insincere and can't be true. So what about Jesus? If Jesus is our example, well, then I say to you that means that being nice, being kind, is not always the answer for every conversation. There's the Jesus that we hold up as a symbol, and then there's the Jesus that you actually encounter when you read the stories. Sometimes the truth cuts. It hurts, it divides. It asks us to make decisions, small and big, good and bad, all along the way. So James, thinking about the tongue and the power of speech, he's echoing similar observations in what is often called Jewish wisdom literature, the book of Sirach, which is officially in the Episcopal Bible along with the Catholics, but we don't read from it much. It says this: honor and dishonor come from speaking, and the tongue of mortals will be their downfall. Don't be called double-tongued, and don't lay traps with your tongue, for shame comes to the thief, and severe condemnation to the double-tongued. In great and small matters cause no harm, and do not become an enemy instead of a friend, for a bad name incurs shame and reproach, and so it is with those of ill speech. This is very much woven into the way Jesus was a teacher in his time. They very much would teach in terms of, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. In fact, if you read Jesus closely, there are times if you're paying attention and you're being clear-eyed, you might ask the question, is he contradicting himself? And the answer is yes. And he's doing it intentionally, because this was their style of teaching. Even in the middle of the Garden of Eden, which was very much a part of his subconscious about the realities of the world, the tree of the knowledge of good and not good, good and not good. Maybe what we need to do is to argue like Jesus was given to do, to argue a little bit with James. That James, in his presentation of something that really was passionate for him, that we move away from his grandiose, big conundrum that he puts before us, and rather just admit the realities of day-to-day interactions with people. That each of us, all along the way, find ourselves at these small verbal forks in the road, don't we? And you have to decide, moment to moment, am I going to be Jimmy Kimmel, or am I going to be Jimmy Fallon? We make those micro adjustments all the time, even if you're not aware of them. Who better than Peter to pair this teaching with in James? Peter, he's always presented as the one who's willing to risk, whether it's something that he says or something that he does. And so Peter, in this exchange, who do you say that I am? He speaks out what many of them were thinking, but they were afraid to commit to. And it was in that confidence, when Jesus praises him, in the wake of that confidence, that Peter decides that he's going to take another risk. And so when Jesus begins to speak of his own death, and that it would be imminent and necessary, Peter is sure that he can take Jesus on, that must be the right answer in this situation. But he didn't, did he? What did Jesus say to him? Get behind me, Satan. That was a time for Peter to not risk, to listen, to maybe slow down and ask Jesus, help me understand. Tell me what you mean. To think, to pray. To ask God and himself if there was something that he wasn't seeing, to hold his tongue. And all of us can imagine how Peter felt in that moment, right? The rush of blood that moves through your chest into your face, the embarrassment. Not many of you should be teachers. That's what James says. He warns you. Words are powerful, and we need to know what to say and when to say it and how. Earlier in the book of James, you heard me say this to the children. Earlier in the book of James, he says this that's very comforting in the difficulty of this. He says, if any of you needs wisdom, ask God, who is generous and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. Really. I say to you that God is too much of a rascal not to be found sometimes in sarcasm, in satire, and cutting wit, because what the Messiah came to do was to bring love that sometimes comforts and sometimes disturbs. There are times when sharp words will help with such things. But we have to ask God to give us the wisdom to know, minute by minute, moment by moment, person by person, situation by situation, whether or not we're going to be Jimmy Kimmel or be Jimmy Fallon. Ask God. Ask him. And he's generous. He will give you wisdom. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.